Good afternoon and welcome to the meeting of the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying. I'd like to begin by welcoming all the witnesses as well as those watching to this meeting on the web. My name is Yana Martin and I'm the Senate Joint Chair of this committee. I'm joined by the Honorable Mark Garneau, the House of Commons Joint Chair. Today we're continuing our examination of the statutory review of the provisions of the Criminal Code relating to medical assistance in dying and their application. The Board of Internal Economy requires that committees adhere to the health protocols which are in effect until June 23, 2022. And as joint chairs, we will enforce these measures and we thank you for your cooperation. I'd like to remind members and witnesses to keep their microphones muted unless recognized by name by the Joint Chair. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the Joint Chair, and when speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. Interpretation in this video conference will work like in an in-person committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen of either Floor, English, or French. So with that, I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank you for your patience as we went a little bit over on the first hour. I'd like to introduce them. So as an individual, we have Ramona Coelho, physician. Disability Without Poverty's representative, Michelle Hewitt, co-chair of the Board of Directors, and Bill Adair, executive director of Spinal Cord Injury Canada. So thank you for joining us, and we will begin with opening remarks by Dr. Coelho, followed by Ms. Hewitt and Dr. Adair. So Dr. Coelho, you will have 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My family medical practice cares for marginalized patients, including those living in poverty, refugees, men out of prison or facing charges, the LGBTQ+ community, Indigenous persons, and those struggling with mental health, addictions, chronic pain, and disabilities. I myself have experienced childhood racism, bullying, and sexual abuse, so I understand that the choice to die can easily be influenced by injustices that life has dealt us. At prior committees, I had raised concerns that inequalities and circumstances such as poverty, trauma, lack of timely access to medical lead to MAID being raised as a treatment option to such a victim of discrimination. I warned that many injuries and illnesses are accompanied by transient suicidality that ends with adaptation and support, but on average takes 2 years. But then the overwhelming majority of persons after those 2 years rate their quality of life as the same as age-matched healthy individuals. Offering MAID in a period of known increased suicidality would lead to premature deaths of those who would have recovered. Now Bill C-7 is legal. A man had a small stroke affecting his balance and swallowing. The patient was depressed and isolated due to COVID-19 outbreak on his ward. The stroke neurologist anticipated the man would be able to eat normally and regain most of his balance. He declined all therapy and psychiatry diagnosed him with an adjustment disorder, but they felt he would improve. However, he requested MAID. Neither of his MAID assessors had any experience in stroke rehabilitation and recovery. In this acute phase, while struggling with his mood and isolation, with no therapy to gauge his final level of function, he received MAID. He had no terminal illness, but due to the fact that he was adapting to a slightly thickened diet, and so was temporarily slightly undernourished, they considered him Track 1 eligible, and he received MAID the following week. No safeguards were technically broken, and yet he died when acutely down, isolated, and had not experienced living with maximal recovery from his stroke. Mr. E.N. was a 71-year-old widower admitted to hospitals for falls. During his admission, he contracted C. difficile, an infectious diarrheal illness. He was openly humiliated by staff for the smell of his room. He developed new shortness of breath that was not comprehensively assessed. Without patient request, a hospital team member raised and recommended MAID to him. The team said he had COPD and it held a terminal prognosis. The MAID procedure was booked by the hospital team before he even had a second assessment, and within 48 hours of his first assessment, he was dead. Post-mortem tests confirmed no significant COPD, and his family doctor also said he didn't have end-stage COPD, but no one had contacted her for collateral history. MAID was raised to this patient. There is no safeguard in Bill C-7 that forbids raising MAID, and the related amendment was voted down by the Senate. CAMAP has a document called Bringing Up MAID, and Susan McDonald had mentioned in this committee that MAID should be raised as part of the informed consent process. Was raised MAID because his admission was longer than expected, because he was a victim of ageism? Did he choose MAID because his acute care team made him feel horrible? His family believes so. The In Plain Sight BC report and the tragic story of Joyce Echequan demand that we take these considerations seriously. And lastly, after a CTV W5 story showed a gentleman's MAID provision, a patient, the immediate Monday, let me know that the story was super appealing and MAID would be good for her. My patient is in her early midlife, has a recent spinal cord injury. She hasn't had time to adjust, receive peer support, or proper symptom control, nor reach maximal recovery. But she does now qualify for Track 2 MAID within 90 days. The legislation is built in a way that allows for her death before she's had a chance to experience maximal recovery. This case also shows that the government must consider current suicide research that shows that messaging promoting suicide may lead to more people choosing that. The MAID regime appears to be allowing a right to die with government assistance for certain groups. Inadequate safeguards suggest that this has been packaged and thinly veiled as a medical procedure. If this is not the case, then I ask your government to reconsider its MAID regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coelho. Next, we will have Ms. Hewitt. You have 5 minutes, Ms. Hewitt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am a disabled woman with multiple sclerosis, and I live in Kelowna, BC. At times, my disease has been aggressive, and it's fairly advanced. I use a power wheelchair, and I have severe fatigue, and I have pain, which is sometimes severe. However, I have a great quality of life. Today, I represent disability without poverty. Roughly 2 in 10 people living in Canada are disabled. But looking at just those who live in poverty, 4 in 10 of them are disabled. Disabled people are overrepresented. There are twice as many disabled people living in poverty than statistics alone would account for. Often they live in abject poverty, as disability assistance payments are usually as low as half or 2/3 of the poverty line. We know that disabled people have been granted MAID because the intolerable suffering they face is caused by poverty, and there are conditions that they would consider acceptable to relieve that suffering. These are just 2 examples of people from BC. Sean had ALS and wanted to live at home. He managed to do so for a number of years. When the constant stress of finding the right care on his own became too much, his health authority offered him to place him in long-term care, 4 hours away from his 10-year-old son. Instead, Sean chose MAID. He described the funding decisions and institutional offerings advanced by the health authority as a death sentence. Madeline has post-viral syndrome and has been living with it for 30 years. There are no Health Canada approved treatments, but she found a combination of treatments that works for her, and they all require her to pay out of pocket. However, she has exhausted all options financially and is currently getting by month to month on GoFundMe payments. When the money runs out, Madeline says she'll have no option but to use MAID, which she has already qualified for. She says she has no wish to die, but she'll be facing an unbearable wall of pain that has no quality of life. No one in Canada should ever die because they live in poverty. And yet, for disabled people, we hasten that death. We provide a state-sanctioned procedure for those disabled people to die. For Sean and Madeline, we have remedies to their suffering that would have been acceptable to them. Sean and Madeline have been vocal in the media about their needs and the remedies to their suffering. However, we heard nothing in response to this from the government. Either the government believes that disability accommodations set out in law do not need to be upheld, or it does not take its role to oversee the MAID safeguards seriously, because Sean and Madeline's suffering came from a social condition, not their medical condition. I cannot believe that that was ever the intention of MAID, that we sanction the deaths of disabled people because they live in poverty. And yet we see it happening. I ask that you recognise that the safeguards are failing, and I ask that you support disabled lives, support the Canada Disability Benefit Bill, and ensure that it lifts all disabled people out of poverty. Implement wide reform to our care systems that give disabled people the care they want. Until these conditions are met, MAID eligibility must be restricted to those who are approaching the end of their life, where their suffering is intolerable from their medical condition, not from the societal conditions they are forced to live under. I finish with Madeline's words. I'm trying really hard not to freak out, but that I'm facing death for something that can be managed is bloody ridiculous, and it makes me so angry. I die when I run out of money. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hewitt. And lastly, we'll have Mr. Adair. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Bill Adair. I work for Spinal Cord Injury Canada, founded in 1945 by World War II veterans. Veterans who came back home to a country that expected very little from them. Veterans who dismissed the idea that they would be shut away in convalescent homes. Our founders fought in battles overseas and then back home to provide the proof that their lives are worth living. In fact, 13 of our founders received the Order of Canada because of what they did after the war. But apparently 72 years later, people with spinal cord injuries still need to fight to prove that their lives are worth living. It's tiring fighting for existence, but here we are. I have worked with our SCI Federation for 33 of those 72 years. Our organizations across the country support people as they adjust, adapt, and thrive while living with a spinal cord injury. I've fielded requests for support for half of my life. My experience as the past Chief Executive Officer of Spinal Cord Injury Ontario, and now the Executive Director of Spinal Cord Injury Canada, provide me with a distinct expertise to talk about MAID and its potential impact on people with spinal cord injuries. I'm here to speak with you about two issues: the 90-day wait period and the lack of real choice for persons when they are offered MAID. The 90-day wait period is arbitrary. There are very good reasons, especially related to people with spinal cord injuries, why this wait period should be longer. A recent study found that 50% of respondents with a spinal cord injury had suicidal ideation in the first 2 years post-injury. Another study found that after the first year post-injury, more than 70% of people rated their life equal to or better than pre-life injury. I know from my work, it can take anywhere from several months to up to 7 years or more for a person to mourn their loss and accept their new life. Rehabilitation, court battles, finding accessible housing, and possible work retraining can take years. Sustaining a spinal cord injury is a huge life change. While lying in bed in acute care or in rehab, a person does not possibly have all the information needed to make a life or death decision. And as you know, it takes time to think about all the options, listen to people's views, understand what resources are available and what is not. 90-day wait is not a safeguard for the 4,000 or more people with a new spinal cord injury in Canada each year. Imagine the loss to our society if we allow our fellow citizens to make an impulsive, uninformed decision during the early stages of rebuilding a life that is worth living. Which one of these people could have been our next Order of Canada recipient? My second concern is that people do not have a real choice when they request MAID. When a person discusses MAID with a doctor, they should also be offered other choices such as home services, long-term care, basic living funds, suicide prevention, psychiatric services, safe, accessible, affordable housing. But these services are not offered, or they're offered actually, but not available because of a wait list, or they're too expensive, or they're too far away. Then the person isn't really being offered a choice, are they? The person is in fact being denied a choice. It's MAID or nothing. Many people with a disability suffer because of a lack of available services and being left to live in crushing poverty, not because of their disability. In turn, the lack of available services and a life in poverty kills hope and drives people to choose MAID to end their misery. This is not the Canada that any of us want. Here's my list of proposed solutions. Extend the wait period if a person is not at the end of life. Implement the Canadian Disability Benefit now. Fund the trained professionals from organizations to go into healthcare centers to provide peer support when someone requests MAID. Build accessible, affordable housing. As parliamentarians, you have a responsibility to change this horrible situation and to prevent it. Please give my recommendations a sober second thought. And thank you for listening and inviting me here.
Thank you, Mr. Adair, and thank you to all of our witnesses. So we'll go into our first round of questions, and we'll begin with Mr. Cooper for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. Dr. Coelho, can you elaborate a little more on the case of the first patient you cited who suffered from a stroke and was granted medical assistance in dying under the Bill C-14 regime, despite not having a terminal diagnosis as required by law under Bill C-14?
So actually, Mr. Cooper, just to clarify, it was more recent than that, but should have fallen under Track 2 under the Bill C-7 regime. This patient did not have any terminal comorbidities and was not dying from his stroke, as is normal custom when someone has a stroke and has difficulty swallowing. We progress diets slowly to avoid aspiration, so like pneumonia and things like this. And he did not choke or aspirate before he died. The dietitian ordered a normal progression of meals, so he was eating 1,300 calories a day, which is probably what I eat. And he ate his whole tray, every tray, easily. But even if it wasn't, and it was temporary. However, I guess this was beyond the scope of the MAID assessor's expertise because he wasn't starving, but they decided that he wouldn't be able to survive on a diet as such, and therefore qualified him for Track 1 so that he could die with no reflection period.
Thank you for that, Dr. Coelho. Can you elaborate on the patient who you were recently in contact with who watched the W5 program and now is found, as you said, found MAID appealing?
So this is my own patient who I love very much, and I did ask her permission to tell her story today. And she actually said, as did every single contact in every story I've shared, I've also emailed the chairs with other stories that I couldn't fit here. They all are willing to talk to this committee. They want to share their stories about what happened. But she wants to tell you that she is very worried about the poverty she will be thrown into if she can't go back to work, and that she'd rather die than live in poverty. And I'm happy to be connected with the clerk, whoever I need to give you all of these stories. They're all recent stories, including the ones I already said sent to Madam and Mr. Chair.
Madam Chair? 2.5 minutes. Okay, Dr. Coelho, can you elaborate on the second patient who chose MAID on the basis of an incorrect diagnosis. And splitting your time, Mr. Adair, can you talk a little bit about some of the phone calls your organization has been receiving in regard to MAID from persons who suffer from spinal cord injuries?
Okay, I will try to be very, very quick. I have actually reviewed this medical chart and met with the family myself. The family relates that there was severe humiliation that he endured. The staff would leave.
All right, Dr. Coelho, your sound is affected at this time, so.
And he did, oh, sorry, is something wrong?
Yes. Yes, would you begin again? Your sound cut out. I think we're having some technical difficulties, so after that we'll get Mr. Adair to respond as well. Go ahead, Dr. Coelho.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
So basically he was being humiliated by, so basically I did talk to the family. I reviewed the medical chart myself. He was being humiliated by staff. They would leave the windows open, complain when they had to change him. He couldn't get in touch with his family that often. He would go hungry when they cleared his food trays. And in this context, he developed shortness of breath that wasn't comprehensively accessed. And he was become so confused that his oxygen, when it slipped off his face, they had to cancel his second assessment. And the second assessor told the family that she would have to go off the first assessment. And so he received MAID in a very sloppy fashion without proper diagnosis. As I said, the family doctor was never consulted and the diagnosis was not confirmed in hospital or through collateral history taking.
Mr. Adair?
Yes, there's multiple calls that come into our organization, to our organizations across the country. I'm happy to speak about two of them. I had a phone call several weeks ago from a colleague who was representing a woman who was 17 years old, who was in intensive care, who had a high-level spinal cord injury, and she was wanting to access MAID. So since then, our organization has been able to connect with the family, help them see that there is life after this initial insult of paralysis, and she has turned away from that. So we're grateful for that, but the fact that there's a 17-year-old woman who has enormous potential to contribute to our country, even considering MAID, is very problematic. The other is a woman who's in her mid-30s and contacted me and has multiple disabilities and has been looking for housing that would support her independence and her ability to return to work after the onset of a second disability after having a spinal cord injury. And after 10 years, her words, to paraphrase, I'm ready to throw in the towel. I cannot take this anymore. I want to lift myself out of poverty. I want to get a job, but I can't find a place to live that will support my independence.
Thank you, Mr. Adair. Next, we have Mr. Maloney. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Co-Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for very compelling and helpful testimony. Enlightening too, I might add. Dr. Coelho, I agree with what you just said. Nobody should ever have to. Their circumstances that you've described are appalling. I forget the language you used, but I agree with you. It sounds to me like, based on the facts as you presented them anyway, that particular situation may have been a result of poor quality of care than the laws that were in place. But that's just my interpretation. So my question really is, I do agree with you. Nobody's financial circumstances, nobody, because they're impoverished or mental health issues or disability status should ever be lead somebody to a situation where MAID is the option because of that. So my question is, are there safeguards that can be put in place, in your opinion, that can protect against that? Because I don't know if you've seen it or not, but there's an expert panel recently released their findings last week, and they addressed some of these issues. And I was looking for the specific recommendation while you were talking. I couldn't find it, but in there somewhere is a recommendation that there be a comprehensive process as part of the assessment to make sure that those aren't circumstances that are giving rise to the request. Is that possible in your opinion?
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. So just first to touch on what you were asking about that case with negligence and possible discrimination and a longer admission that they had wanted or anticipated, I do think it raises a real problematic issue. Like Abby Hoffman came to this committee and said there are no cases of hardly any cases of non-compliance. It means that Health Canada is not able to capture the data correctly for safety and monitoring, and that really concerns me. The second thing about the expert panel, I did actually review the expert panel, which is actually made for mental illness as a sole condition.
Mm-hmm.
And the expert panel is very interesting because, first of all, they never answered the question of can this be done for mental illness, considering that we have a lot of evidence that we have no prognosticators to know for sure if someone is irremediable, so actually meeting the eligibility criteria for MAID if this is really a medical procedure. And secondly, they offer 19 cautions. So there are 19 things that they consider are very dangerous.
Let me focus on, do you think that there could be safeguards put in place to protect against the concerns you've raised? That's my real question.
So if you heard me in Bill C7, I had actually proposed several safeguards, including never raising it to a patient, as they do in the Australia legislation, that people should be able to, in their professional integrity, decline things for scientific data, for example, like patients with disabilities where we know the outcome takes years. There was an MP Green who tried to put forward an amendment about making sure that psychosocial issues were not the reason people were getting MAID, and these were all voted down. I feel that the MAID regime is really, really dangerous.
Have you put these suggestions in writing and submitted them to the committee?
I did send a brief on May 6th, and it is still not up in the written testimony.
And is everything you've just said contained in there, all these suggestions you're talking about?
I can resend you my testimony from Bill C7 if it's helpful, sir, Madam Chair.
If you want to do that, that would be useful. Okay, so my question is then for everybody, and I'm running out of time, and I apologize. I recently attended a presentation at a palliative care facility, and it was interesting to me because they said at the beginning when MAID first became the law in Canada, 12 out of 12 doctors at the facility were opposed to it. 6 months later, 6 were accepting it, and now all 12 are accepting it because that's what the patient wanted. So my question to all three of you, has there been any change in the thinking in the disability community over the last number of years? I'll start with you, Mr. Adair.
There's less than a minute, so perhaps two of the witnesses could answer this. Mr. Maloney? So Mr. Adair first. Oh, you are muted, Mr. Adair.
Thank you for your question. I don't know that there's been any growth in that area that I'm aware of. You'd have to ask others who have more information and expertise.
Okay, Ms. Hewitt, what about you?
I would thank you for the question. I would also say that I don't have data to support it, but certainly anecdotally, people within the disability community are talking about MAID more often and seeing it as a response to societal conditions more than medical conditions. They feel that they're suffering and there is a solution to it. They're not getting that solution, so therefore MAID.
Thank you very much. And next we'll have Monsieur Thériault for 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their testimony, which will, of course, shed light on our deliberations. I'll begin with Mr. Adair. First, I'd like to thank you. Your association is important. it's striking that a young person, about 20 years old, could suffer a spinal cord injury and life changes dramatically. And it's clear that there's a social disability and an individual impact, and no matter what it is, there should be as few social obstacles as possible, and it's a daily battle, and you work to make it less and less of an obstacle, but it's a shock. I imagine it's a shock. And I was thinking, you'd like to have stronger safeguards. I understand that. The safeguard that would mean not beginning the discussion with a patient for a healthcare professional. Would that be at the beginning after the shock? Would that be a good safeguard? That is to say, for your patients.
The best safeguard is to work with the family and with the person who has the new injury, connect them with families and individuals who have gone through this initial phase of a terrifying shock in many ways, and have gotten through that and have rebuilt amazing lives, and many lives that are, as I said before, stronger and more satisfying than they were before the injury. Certainly not mentioning the option of MAID for people with new injuries would be preferable, and just not having it available until people have had an opportunity to test life and to find out the kind of dreams that they can build and that they will be able to pursue in their new life.
But do you not believe, Mr. Adair, that a good medical practice, well, after a traumatic shock like this, that it would be a good practice not to propose this option, that would be good medical practice? And with the experience you have, because of course I agree with you, there needs to be support for this person so that this person can see what their life could be like, their contribution. I understand all of that. And that would be over time, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. But do you think there could be people for whom after 5 or 6 years, the only thing they would want would be medical assistance in dying despite all of your good care?
The first point is no, I don't think MAID should be mentioned or offered to people when they are in acute care and even in rehabilitation after sustaining a spinal cord injury. Do I think people down the road, say, as you said, 7 years or 8 years, it is again a situation where it's important to look at all the variables, and it's a hypothetical situation, and I can't say it would be would be a good thing or not. I can say that I have not witnessed that. What I have witnessed is that after people turn the corner and rebuild their dreams and rebuild their lives, that suicide is not something that they turn back on, other than if there are multiple compounding problems that they face, such as in the social supports area. Housing is a major theme. Affordable, accessible housing and living in poverty are crushers. They crush people's souls. And I think it's also important to say sir, that I don't speak for everyone with a spinal cord injury, and each person is an individual who ultimately has a right to decide if there in fact is informed choice and a real choice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Theriault. Thank you. And next we have Mr. McGregor. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. Ms. Hewitt, I think I'd like to start my questioning with you. If you look at the mandate of our committee, it's actually quite broad. I mean, we were appointed to review the provisions of the criminal code relating to medical assistance in dying and their application. But we're also including things like mature minors, advance requests, mental illness, the state of palliative care in Canada, but also the protection of Canadians with disabilities. And when you think of that last part, you know, like this is part of our committee's mandate, the protection of Canadians with disabilities. Like, what comes to mind for you with regard to that instruction to this committee from the House of Commons?
Thank you for your question. For me, that part of your mandate is why I asked to be a witness to this committee. I strongly believe that as a nation, we're not protecting disabled people at the moment. So, I strongly believe that you cannot advance with expansion of MAID until we've dealt with some of those issues. For example, 7% of the people living in our long-term care facilities are younger disabled people who have no other option but to live there. I can tell you that they don't want to be there. And of course, the person I talked about, Sean, who passed away through MAID before C7, he did not want to be there either. And he chose MAID over living in long-term care. That tells me that we are not protecting these people. This is a real concern to me as someone with MS and someone, that advocates for the MS Society as well as Disability Without Poverty, that we are just not providing these basic societal conditions that disabled people are able to have a choice about their futures. So, in an institutional life in somewhere that is designed for 85-year-olds with dementia when you're in your 30s or your 40s, and as Mr. Adair has talked about, often in this rehab phase where your situation is new to you, it's crushing. And on top of that, you're going to be living in poverty, and you're not, in BC here, in our long-term care homes, the average amount of care a day is 3.28 hours. That's not per person, that's an average. So if there is somebody in the facility who needs more time, who is that person, with severe dementia that needs time, you are not getting those 3.28 hours. You are getting substantially less. And as people with MS, with fatigue needs and so on, I know many people who, for them, the fear of long-term care would seek them, they prefer to choose to be eligible for MAID, and it seems that eligibility is happening at the moment.
You made a great deal of separating intolerable suffering from a medical condition versus a person's social conditions. And we don't want to speak in a broad brush for everyone. Everyone's different, and it's a very subjective term. But I guess for you, thinking about the safeguards, at a bare minimum, what do you want to see, in terms of protections, so that the social conditions are not influencing a person, and really they are looked after, but they still feel that their medical condition, despite all the supports they may have, is still leading them to a life of intolerable suffering. What's the bare minimum we need to be aiming for as a country here?
Right. Thank you again for that question. So Madeline, who I talked about, is a friend of mine, and I know that you're in BC and Madeline is in BC. She has treatment options that have worked for her, and those have now been removed because she can't afford to pay for them. if there is a track record of treatment that works, the removal of that treatment cannot therefore lead to MAID. So, I believe that where the person is able to state what they need to have that intolerable suffering removed, I believe that those should be in place before they become eligible for MAID. And if we cannot do that as a country, therefore we must return to that original sense of MAID, of being towards the end of life for terminal conditions, and we have to fix those conditions for disabled people.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And I'll now hand this over to the co-chair for the round of questions for senators.
Thank you, Senator. On va aller au Sénat.
We will go to senators now because one of the senators has left. The 3 remaining senators will have a bit more time. We'll begin with Senator Meiji. You have the floor. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for your information. My first question will be for Dr. Coelho. I would like you to be concise. When I practiced, I had a patient who had multiple sclerosis who was really suffering, that just had a little bit of mobility in his fingers to be able to bring his fingers to his mouth. And he said that if one day my heart stops, don't do anything, let me die. And then that happened, his heart stopped, we brought him back to life, and he said to me, "Good thing I was brought back to life. I can think clearly, I don't want to die." So do you have patients like that? And bringing that patient 20 years to 2022, would this type of patient ask for medical assistance in dying? So could you be concise, because I have a question for Ms. Hewitt.
I will try my best, and thank you for the question. Through Mr. Chair, I would say that I also did home care. I didn't have time in my thing. I did home care for people with severe mental health addictions, dementia, and disabilities in Montreal before I relocated to London. And many, many times I've accompanied people through suffering, medical suffering and psychosocial suffering, and they were able to overcome and be super happy to be alive. And most of it required time. The CLSC system in Montreal was amazing when I was there. We had PSWs and a whole care team, and we were able to abate those death wishes.
Merci.
Thank you. My question for Ms. Hewitt, and probably Mr. Adair if he would like to add something. I know you're aware that there was a letter co-signed by 43 senators in January 2022 to call on the federal government to promote the bill on the Canadian disability benefit. Do you think that if there was that guaranteed basic income for people who have a disability, would that be enough to prevent them from asking for MAID, in your opinion?
Thank you so much for your question. I think there's many things about the Canada Disability Benefit that are still unknown. Eligibility, the amount. There are things that relate to how much it actually costs, to where the poverty line would sit if you are somebody who is disabled, and research from other countries would say that it's 40% more than the disability line for those who don't have disabilities. The poverty line is the poverty line, and a common phrase that I know Mr. Dare has heard me use is that it's not lollipops and rainbows, it's still the poverty line. It's a start of where we need to get people to. The other, when it comes to, as Mr. Adair spoke to, housing, when it comes to treatment, we need people to be able to function so that they can deal with their disability rather than dealing with the double whammy of their disability and abject poverty. So it's a start, but do I think that the Canada Disability Benefit alone will stop disabled people accessing MAID? My personal opinion is no, that it's one of a package of measures that we need to do as a country.
Merci, sénatrice.
Thank you, Senator. We'll have to go now to Senator Kutcher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have three short questions for Dr. Coelho and then one slightly longer one for Michelle Hewitt. Dr. Coelho, is there, we have heard that many MAID providers are family physicians. We're wondering, is there a consensus amongst family physicians that all family physicians should inform patients about MAID even if their conscience precludes it?
I'm so sorry, Senator Kutcher. I don't know what you're talking about.
So if a family physician feels that in their conscience they shouldn't tell a patient about MAID, do all family physicians think that every family physician must at all times tell patients about MAID being available?
I honestly, I'm so sorry, I'm struggling. I don't know that there's any consensus on this issue. I'm saying that Susan McDonald and other people at the committee said that it should be part of informed consent, and I'm saying that's a very dangerous principle to apply when we know that there's discrimination in healthcare, like the BC report in plain sight demonstrates.
Thanks. I appreciate that. That's what I was asking, whether there was consensus on that. The second question, again, is for our family physicians, do they have consensus about MAID being provided to track one patients as they currently are identified? Is there consensus amongst family physicians that they should be provided?
Again, through Mr. Chair, Senator Kutcher, I don't actually know. I'm not an academic family physician. I'm a family physician who works really in the margins. I do connect with other family doctors who work in marginalized communities. We are all concerned about this, but I have no idea and I can't comment on the consensus of family doctors.
Okay, so you wouldn't know whether there's consensus among family doctors or not consensus about any aspect of MAID provision?
I really wouldn't, so I can't answer the question. I'm sorry.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate you trying. To Michelle Hewitt, I think that everyone in this committee would agree that poverty and any other social or economic factors should not be the driver for MAID provision. The expert committee report noted that persons with a disability who request MAID should be offered housing and income assistance and other needed supports. Would you agree that such safeguards should be provided to any person with disability who requests MAID?
I would say that housing, not to live in poverty, access to treatment should be provided to all disabled people, whether they are approaching MAID or not. I believe that disabled lives are worth living, that we contribute to our society in so many ways. And at the moment, there is a lot of suffering in the disability community that isn't caused by our disabilities or impairments.
First, I completely agree with you on that. The question is, our discussion is about MAID, however. So,
right.
So the question is if a person is disabled and doesn't have adequate housing and doesn't have adequate social supports, should, as part of that MAID assessment, those be offered to the person? That's
Absolutely.
the question.
Absolutely.
And how urgent would that be, in your opinion?
I would say that they are extremely urgent, and that a person who has got to the position of applying for MAID is already in crisis and would need a lot of support to put those complex pieces in place. And I would hope that that's what we would be offering. That there would be a position, a person, a body that would examine those complex pieces that went into those decisions. And as I've said, I use the example of my friend Madeline. She knows exactly what she needs to not access MAID. She needs the treatment options that she can't afford and work for her successfully.
Right, and so someone says, look, this is helpful to me and I need it to be helpful to me. This should be considered and every effort should be made to provide that to them.
Absolutely.
Very much.
Thank you very much, Senator. We'll now go to Sénateur Delphond pour 4 minutes.
Senator Delphond, 4 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Will be for Mrs. Owitt. You saw the task force report, and I'm sure you read it as I did. The members of the group have expressed consensus on the way the evaluation shall be made, and they have stressed the importance of socio-economic factors in the thinking process of the requester. So am I to understand from what you say this is not enough, and if this is not enough, what they are proposing to make sure the assessment rests on a proper informed consent and not a short reaction to socioeconomic difficulties? So what kind of other guidelines would you suggest we add to prevent people from requesting, or at least not requesting, but receiving MAID? Because there's a distinction before requesting it and getting the assessors to agree that you're entitled to it.
I'm sorry, was that addressed to me? I think it was.
Yes, sorry, I wasn't clear, sorry.
My apologies, it was a
sorry,
switch
Mrs.
over on
Witt.
technology.
Sorry.
I think, as I just mentioned, the role there has to be not just to examine that those conditions are leading to someone to follow through with MAID, but the solutions have to be put in place. That's the piece that is missing. That somebody who that the assessor sees that that there are these extraordinary needs that are causing this suffering. If it was we take great lengths in this country to take care of all kinds of people in all kinds of ways. And we had an incredible response when we started a pandemic, right? And we found vaccines and we rolled them out and those sorts of things. We rose to the challenge. We are not rising to that challenge when it comes to these people who are in such crisis that they are not only asking to access MAID, but they are following through and dying. And I can only refer you back to my friend Madeline and her desperate need for treatment.
That, for example, one of the safeguards is that there's a 90-day period. So if somebody is in crisis, there might be time will help maybe to solve the crisis. And also that the assessors must try to understand the real reason why the person is asking to have access to MAID, and to try to redirect that person to proper social assistance if available.
So my question would be back to you all. What if that proper assistance is not available, but it is still necessary to relieve that suffering? I strongly urge you to say that, that we're better than this. We can find these solutions for these people, and that accessing MAID for, for non-medical reasons, for suffering that can be alleviated by other conditions, is simply unacceptable. So those assessors, in those safeguards, in that 90 days, what are they going to do? Who's going to take that responsibility? And are you, as parliamentarians, going to stand up and say, yes, we will fund those things that desperately need to happen, because that's what we need?
Thank you.
Merci, Sénateur.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Martin for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair, and I just want to thank the witnesses for your very compelling testimonies. And Mr. Adair, my father suffered from spinal cord injury, and he showed us his incredible strength through the suffering that he endured. Thank you for your important work. My question is for Dr. Coelho. I'm wondering if you could comment on the scope of MAID that's being looked at by our committee. Just any comments you have as a family physician and the experience you bring.
Thank you, through Mr. Chair. I've watched every hour of the AMAD committee thus far, and up till today, committee members have disputed the truthfulness of stories that have been shared by witnesses who've come forward and said that MAID professionals are beyond question. Inconsistently, there's been talking on top of experts who have been warning about caution and even questioning their integrity. As well, some physicians on the committee have really failed to provide expected medical expertise surrounding clinical epidemiology or correct guidance on how to approach this as a medical procedure. The cases of concern that we've all mentioned signal that the MAID regime safeguards do not work to protect Canadians. These stories contradict those statements by Abby Hoffman and committee that there are simply no problems with the MAID regime. And actually point to inadequate data collection when you can't make good decisions if you don't have data. Committee members asking loaded questions with only one-word answers have tried to paint concerned witnesses as wanting Canadians to suffer through years of useless treatment. But actually, the reality is that patients are waiting years for treatment, and this wears people down. Consider, Alan Weeb testified that if someone wanted MAID because it took 5 years to access the service, she would consider that irremediable. Patients with unaddressed psychosocial suffering will be therefore given MAID by assessors like her. And Audrey Bayless said she'd rather die than living in a nursing home. That is actually a statement about the atrocious state of our underfunded long-term care centers. Also, I keep hearing a recurring legal argument that withholding MAID from certain groups is discriminatory. But this is not how medicine works. In medicine, we have strict medical standard of care safeguards as well as required eligibility to meet a criteria for a treatment. Persons with mental illness, with or without disability, which is often exacerbated by psychosocial suffering, have a disease process that can predispose them to suicidality with no proof that their suffering is irremediable. We just don't have the evidence. Thomas Insel, former head of the NIMH, wrote a book called Healing, in which he confirms the unknown prognosis of mental health disorders, but outlines how prognosis does depend on community life, supports, and productivity. Purpose. In light of this, the government providing death as an option while simultaneously failing its duty to provide timely care, supports, enriching community life, livable income is actually quite shameful. Mr. Luc Thériault reassured us that if the expert panel and special joint committee arrive at the conclusion that mental illness should be excluded, we should be reassured it would be. But we know that the expert panel didn't even weigh on that important question. But the Quebec Commission has decided that MAID for mental illness should be excluded. Mr. Chair, I thank you for inviting me. The work of this committee is so important, and I ask you for an honest review because your MAID regime is very dangerous.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Senator Martin. This concludes our first panel. I want to, on behalf of all of the committee members, thank Dr. Coelho, Ms. Michelle Hewitt, and Mr. Bill Adair for giving of their time this evening on this extremely important topic on the theme of people living with disabilities in the context of medical assistance in dying. Your testimony is very much appreciated and your candor in answering our questions. We still have a long way to go. We hope you'll follow us as we move forward, but your testimony tonight is very much a part of it. So thank you very much. And with that, colleagues, we will suspend briefly in preparation for the next panel. And Mr. Clerk, tell me when the panelists are up and checked so we can get going so that we can start right away. Thank you. is appearing as an individual. From the Quebec Intellectual Disability Society, Madame Amélie Durand-Lot, qui est directrice
The Executive Director, accompanied by Samuel Rago, Senior Policy Analyst and Advocacy Advisor.
Also, the Wabanaki Council on Disability, Mr. Conrad Solis, Executive Director. Thank you for joining us. The way we do this is we start with opening remarks, and so each of you will be given 5 minutes to make an opening presentation, and we'll follow that with questions. And with that, I would like to invite Ms. Landry to begin, followed by Ms. Durand-Lot and then Mr. Solis. So, Mrs. Landry, you have the microphone for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I won't need 5 minutes. I'm here tonight. First, I'm from the north of New Brunswick, originally from Balmoral. I live in Charlot on the Baie des Chaleurs, and I'm here because my father asked for medical assistance in dying 2 years ago now. That is why I agreed to appear based on my experience. So my dad had the courage of his convictions. He was at the end of his life. He had cancer. He was really suffering. But it had been a few years where he'd said it was his choice. And as a family, of course, we respected his choice. So I'm not happy to have lost my dad. But I'm pleased that he was able to have access to medical aid in dying, that he was able to choose the way he wanted to leave. So that's about it for me. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ms. Landry.
From the Quebec Intellectual Disability Society, Ms. Amélie Durand-Lot. Ms. Durand-Lot, you have 5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, members of the Special Joint Committee on Medical Assistance in Dying, AMAD. We would first like to thank you for the opportunity you have given the Quebec Intellectual Disability Society today. We wish to make it clear that our organization is not opposed to medical assistance in dying for people nearing the end of their lives. Rather, we ask that adequate safeguards be put in place to ensure that no abuses occur. We believe that legislators must be cautious and consider the systemic forces that could threaten people with disabilities and specifically people with intellectual disabilities. It should be noted here that intellectual disability, or disability in general, should never be a criterion for access to MAID. With the necessary support and appropriate accommodations, people with intellectual disabilities can live fulfilling and rich lives. If people find themselves living with intolerable suffering related to their intellectual disability, it is because society does not include them and they lack services. The Society is also very concerned about the possibility of authorizing substituted consent for incapacitated persons at all stages of MAID applications. This possibility had been raised by the Quebec National Assembly, and even such a question is not under consideration today. It is important to discuss it. On the one hand, the use of MAID should always be tied to the validation of a free and informed consent from the person who will receive it. On the other hand, it may be difficult to assess this consent for incapacitated persons, especially those with a more severe intellectual disability. These persons may experience distress in relation to the death of someone close to them, but it is generally more difficult for them to understand the permanent and irreversible nature of their own death. We therefore call on the legislator not to allow substituted consent for those who lack capacity to consent. Regarding the legislator's desire to potentially allow the use of advance directives for access to MAID, we would like to refocus the debate on the issue of the validity of consent in these situations. Asking a third party to consent to a procedure that leads to death through a substituted decision-making process is different from making advance requests to refuse certain procedures that may lead to natural death. In this light, opening the door to substituted consent, even for people who had previously consented, seems to us to be potentially dangerous and to fail to respect the spirit of the Carter decision, which put the issue of consent at the heart of access to MAID. In our view, it is important to provide satisfactory alternatives for people with disabilities. This position has been advanced by the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Universal and high-quality public services in sufficient quantity must be provided to people who need them. Indeed, this is an obligation that Canada has towards people with disabilities under the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Thus, satisfactory alternatives are needed to provide a dignified life for people with disabilities and for the Canadian population in general. As mentioned previously, we believe that MAID should be a measure of last resort for people who are capable of giving free and informed consent and who, at the end of life, are living in unbearable suffering. We also distinguish between the issues of advanced care directives and advanced directives in relation to MAID. The former allows for natural death, while the latter entails the use of an active procedure that ends life without clear and validated consent. Furthermore, we believe that substituted consent should never be allowed for incapacitated persons, as they cannot provide free and informed consent. The Carter decision put the issue of consent at the heart of access to MAID. It is important to respect this fundamental principle of health, justice, and ethics. Finally, in the event that people with intellectual disabilities at the end of their lives make an application on their own without any undue pressure, then we believe that they should be assessed like all other people, as long as their access to MAID is not granted on the basis of disability. However, it is important to have stronger safeguards in place to prevent ableism and the devaluation of the lives of people with disabilities. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Ms. Durando.
To Mr. Conrad Solis. Mr. Solis, you have 5 minutes.
Good evening. Bonsoir. Waliwan, thank you for the opportunity to present to your committee this evening. My name is Conrad Solis. I am with the Wabanaki Council on Disability. We work to support Indigenous persons with disabilities living on our traditional and ancestral Wabanaki lands. We work closely with a key partner, the Maui Daham Society, a non-reserve group home providing services to persons with disabilities. I want to acknowledge that I am speaking to you this evening from and on the sacred, unceded, unsurrendered ancestral lands of the Algonquin Nation. Well, I want to thank you to the committee for extending the invitation for me to present to you on your work as you investigate MAID. I will say it right away, MAID is not a readily welcomed concept or term for Indigenous peoples of the Wabanaki lands. We have experienced far too much death in our families, in our communities, and in our nation since first contact. Colonization has brought over 500 years of death, of language and cultural knowledge loss, and loss of our ancestral lands for our nations and our people. Believe me when I say that we are far beyond tired of losing things, including our identities as Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit, and our cherished family members. We are tired of mourning the losses and deaths of our young people and of persons with disabilities. Both of these populations are amongst the most highly vulnerable peoples of this country, and we believe that we must do everything we can to help them to continue to live their lives, to find their identities and to be meaningful people in our families, our communities, and our societies. Rather than finding ways of ending the lives of our young people and persons with disabilities, we would so much rather be finding the ways to extend their lives and to keep them in our families. Our families lost far too many children and youth during the residential and day schools era, which lasted for over 125 years. We have lost too many children and youth to child welfare agencies. What we want is to find ways to keep individuals, families, and communities strong and to be embraced in our languages, in our cultures, and in our traditional ancestral knowledge. We want to establish the programs, services, and supports that our youth and persons with disabilities need. They do not need to find a way to die. They need to find the ways to reestablish their self-worth, to combat mental illness. We want them to be well. They want to be well. We want them to be well in their emotional, spiritual, physical, and mental aspects. We want them to be well in the holistic views of our ancestors, within the teachings of the medicine wheel. We want to see the world, Mother Earth, and life she sustains from the values of our ancestors through the Wabanaki worldview of respecting all life. We don't need or want to establish more ways for Indigenous youth to die. There's enough death in our communities and families already, and there are already enough existing threats. There is so much systemic discrimination in the Canadian medical system. We should all remember Joyce Echaquan and the humiliation she experienced and that contributed to her unnecessary death in a hospital. Ms. Echaquan, sadly, is only one example of the Indigenous people who have died due to systemic racism. There are many, many more in this country. I reached out to Indigenous youth last week on MAID. Their fear was immediate. Their fear of MAID lasted throughout our conversation. They spoke of mental wellness challenges, of youth suicides in their families and communities. They wanted to speak about how we can help our youth to be mentally well, to be able to speak the languages of their ancestors as a way to improve their self-worth, value, and identities. They spoke about how their youth group and their conversations are part of their healing. Talking is healing. Being around people you trust and that care about you is healing. My mother spent her later life helping to heal Wolastoqey children by teaching them the Wolastoqey language in the school they attended. The school was a part of the provincial education system located in the city, not on a reserve. She's passed into the spirit world now, but her legacy continues in the lives of those children she positively impacted through the language and cultural learning. One of our regional partners stated that all Indigenous youth have specific lived experiences with intergenerational trauma stemming from displacement, forced relocations from ancestral lands, the Indian Act, Indian Residential School, the foster care system, etc. For these reasons, we know and have empirical evidence to show that Indigenous youth mental health is poorer compared to non-Indigenous mental health. Last week, the Wabano Health Center and the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition released a new report focused on racism in the healthcare field titled Share Your Story, Indigenous Pacific Racism and Discrimination in Healthcare Across the Champlain Region. Amongst the findings they presented in the report are these. There were 5 stereotypes that emerged from the data. 1, Indigenous people are racially inferior. 2, Indigenous people are diseased, addicted, and mentally unwell. 3, Indigenous people are a burden. 4, Indigenous people are angry and aggressive. 5, Indigenous people are bad parents. I recommend that you should invite the Wabano Health Center and the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition to present to you as well. Thank you, everyone. Merci beaucoup. Tout le monde.
Thank you, Mr. Solis. I'll now hand it over to my co-chair, Senator Martin.
Co-chair, we'll begin with questions for a 5-minute round, and the first questioner will be MP Dominique Vien.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for meeting with us tonight, despite the late hour. Ms. Duralo, good evening. Thank you for being here. Everyone who has an intellectual disability, well, it's concerning when we talk about medical assistance in dying. I'm not super knowledgeable, but there are degrees of intellectual disability. And I understand that you're against, and if I've misunderstood, you can let me know, but I've understood that you're against medical assistance in dying administered to those with an intellectual disability. So would there be a spectrum of intellectual disability? Yes, there's a spectrum. And when we talk about medical assistance in dying, those who are incapacitated, that would only be one portion of people with an intellectual disability. We'd specify that those who have an intellectual disability, many of them could request it themselves because they are able to make decisions about their own lives. I'll let my colleague Samuel Rago complete my answer. Thank you. Certain people who have a lighter intellectual disability are quite capable of requesting the procedure for themselves, by themselves. What's important is that it be done without undue pressure, that there is truly free and informed consent, and that the made request not be done for economic or social reasons, that it really be at the end of life due to intolerable suffering. So track 1. So you would really set a condition. That's what I'm understanding tonight. Yes. What type of abuse do you fear? What worries you? That's an excellent question. Madam Co-Chair, what we hear, and it's tragic, what we sometimes hear, it's parents who are aging, who have children, who may be in their 50s, who have an intellectual disability, who have few to no services, and they wonder what will happen to their children when they themselves die. And sometimes we hear parents who tell us, look, if I could request MAID for my children, I would. That raises significant questions. These are tragic situations. And the answer probably isn't MAID. The answer would be a social answer to provide services, to provide housing, financial security to people. That was discussed earlier. So these are things we hear. And we hear it more and more often, unfortunately. Would you say that people who have an intellectual disability are aware themselves of medical assistance in dying, or it's brought up with them? That's a question that's difficult to answer without generalizing, but certainly we've heard in the newspaper people who had MAID proposed to them because there weren't services. So would there be medical pressure that the lives of people with disabilities aren't valued as much? Certainly. Would some people present legitimate, valid requests with free and informed consent? Certainly as well. But what's more concerning, of course, would be undue pressure, MAID being proposed by default because there isn't anything better. You were talking about substituted consent. That would be when someone can make the decision for a sick child, or rather, who has an intellectual disability. Is that correct? Absolutely. You talk about it because you hear from parents, well, who say, like, look, if it existed, that's what I would choose. Absolutely. It's also something we've heard in Parliament in Quebec, something that was refused in Quebec. It's not in the new law that was tabled. But yes, substituted consent is something that has always been, well, rather than giving real legal capacity to people, rather than giving them tools for them to exercise their own rights, often it's been substituted consent given to parents and families. And that's something we hear in relation to MAID. It's over? Yes.
Next, we will have Dr. Fry. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Today, I guess I heard a lot of compelling evidence of both people who were disabled and for people with intellectual disabilities. And I think all of it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, if we had a system in which we could give everybody the support that they needed, both economically, psychologically, and socially, with support systems in place for them, then if people having lived with that, still believes that they would like to, with informed consent, access made, I can see that happening. But I think you're absolutely right. I was appalled to hear some stories today about people who chose MAID purely because they were living in poverty and couldn't even afford treatments. So I think what are the kind, I mean, I could ask you what should all 3 levels of government do to give that kind of access, to create a system in which, when you look at all of the psychosocial supports that are needed, that they are there, that they're done. What would you suggest we do, all 3 levels of government, to create a seamless system? Because the provinces are responsible for thing A, federal government is not responsible for it, and of course we have a patchwork across the country. So what would you suggest?
Any witness?
I'll ask Monsieur Orago.
Merci pour votre question.
Thank you for your question. It's a very difficult question to answer, but of course, as our colleagues from Canada, Disability Without Poverty, have said, it takes money, decent income, quality, accessible public services, housing, safe housing that's accessible, of high quality, that's adapted to the needs of people with disabilities, transportation that allow people to get to work, to get people to their services. There need to be psychosocial services, psychotherapy, a whole range of services for people with disabilities, a patchwork of services. So people are...
I'm sorry to interrupt, Dr. Fry.
Yes.
I apologize, but there was a slight miscommunication, and Mr. Arsenault will take the other half if that's okay. I believe one of his witnesses here this evening. Thank you, Dr. Fry. So, Mr. Arsenault?
Merci, Madame la Co-Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. My question will be first for Ms. Landry. I know it's late. It's almost 10 p.m. for you. Some who oppose MAID have told us that a lack of palliative care could lead to an increased demand for MAID. Statistics show that about 83% of people who've requested MAID were already receiving palliative care, and that about 15% wanted to not have palliative care and ask for MAID directly. Could you share the experience you had with your father in that context? That was exactly his situation. He was at the end of his life, of course, so technically in palliative care, but it had been years. His illness, well, he'd had cancer for nearly 20 years. He always said that when he no longer had quality of life, when he was suffering too much, that he would opt for medical assistance in dying, and that's exactly what he did. So, of course, he waited. He waited until he no longer had a quality of life to request it. So palliative care, technically he was receiving palliative care, but in palliative care he'd been prescribed morphine, things like that, but he refused. He wanted to remain lucid until the last minute, and he asked for medical assistance in dying. So I was gobsmacked by the presentation earlier. People within 48 hours had access. In my father's case, it took 2 weeks. So he made the request, of course, but there were checks with him, the doctor, and the whole medical team checked with him regularly until the last minute over those 2 weeks. So it wasn't a process that was done quickly. Well, in the sense that it wasn't 48 hours, as was said, as is done elsewhere, it seems. Thank you very much, Ms. Landry. My next question will be for Conrad Solis. Mr. Solis, I hear very well when you say that suicide in your community is not an option, that there needs to be hope and healing. I hope that all communities in Canada, regardless of who they are, have the same message for their youth. But we've heard from expert witnesses last week who said they were able to distinguish between someone who asks for MAID because they are suicidal versus someone who isn't. That reassured a few colleagues here. What do you think of these psychiatrists who say they can distinguish between someone who is suicidal, who wouldn't have access to MAID, and the opposite case?
Your sound isn't working, it seems.
Okay, there we go. Thank you for the question. The measures are of cultural, cultural differences. First Nations, Métis, Inuit. Our cultures are vastly different than mainstream society, than European society. We live in your society. We live in your societies. We live under your terms and conditions. We'd love to be living under our terms and conditions, being assessed by the standards, the values, the morals of the European societies that have come over here and established the governments that are in place. Just do not provide the kind of cultural support nor the knowledge that's required to determine. I think when an Indigenous person might want to be considering or acting on thoughts of suicide or other things like that.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Solis. It's times go so fast here. If you would have one recommendation for a safeguard, only one, what would that be?
Regarding safeguards?
Safeguard, yeah.
Yes. Regarding safeguards, I would definitely say that there needs to be regulatory requirements for people that are involved in the medical field that are providing this advice to individuals. They would need to seek out supportive advice from elders, from knowledge keepers, family members. That would be a legal requirement of those medical people.
Thank you, Mr. Solis. Thank you, Mr. Arsenault. Next, we'll go to Mr. McGregor, followed by Mr. Thériault. Go ahead, Mr. Thériault.
Mr. Thériault. Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. My questions will be for the Quebec Intellectual Disability Society. First, the Quebec Association for Dying with Dignity said in a recommendation that there should be a ban for eligibility for MAID for people who have intellectual disabilities that are serious unless there's absolute certainty about the decision-making capacity of the person. So I was reading your brief for the Quebec Commission in July 2021. So that reflects your second recommendation, which would be banning substituted decision-making for people who have an intellectual disability who are deemed unable to consent. So I would imagine that could reassure you. If I look at the other recommendations you've made, which seem good and would be good medical practice, and I think would reflect what's happening in current medical practice, requiring people who have an intellectual disability to only request MAID if they're at the end of their life. So here, I think we've gotten into the gray area between incapacitated and able to request it. And in such a case, I'd like to know how that would work. How do you determine capacity? Do you have an example of that gray zone to provide to us? Either Ms. Duranlo or Mr. Dago, if you've understood the question. Mr. Dago, yes. Thank you. It's a question that's really not easy to answer. What research seems to indicate is that people who have an intellectual disability understand the death of people around them. That's pretty clear. They understand it. They have a capacity to really experience those situations. What's less clear is, are they able to understand the irreversible aspect for themselves? And so here's a gray area that's very difficult to determine. Well, specifically in Quebec, the difference between medical consent and legal consent for signing a contract is really based on tests of understanding of the medical acts being discussed. I don't think we have perfect tools at this time. To my knowledge, there's no perfect tool to determine whether a person really understands if they were to request MAID or not. And it depends on the severity of the intellectual disability. You would say that a doctor who has a background in intellectual disability should participate in the request. I imagine that's a corollary of what you've explained, and to me it's totally natural. You've raised questions about social and economic inequalities, and I think that assessors need to take that into account, of course. That was raised in the expert panel report on mental health. You've said that any request for a MAID should have a mandatory declaration by the health professional. What are you thinking of? Because there are already reports. There's a commission in Quebec that looks into each medical act that is done. So do you think there needs to be something more, or are you just saying well, what form would that take? So there was this standard for protecting vulnerable people that was proposed in the first bill on medical assistance in dying. And that standard proposed measures to look at the social determinants of health and other determinants of people's vulnerability, and said that there should be more comprehensive documentation to look at the real reasons that may be less clear when it comes to medical assistance in dying. So that's what we're also calling for, because we know that many determinants of health and vulnerability motivate some people who request MAID. Your 7th and 8th recommendations requiring discussions on MAID to be only brought up by patients, and the 9th, talking with the immediate family when assessing a request for MAID in the case of intellectual disabilities. I think these are measures that should be part of medical practice. Do you have the impression that assessors or providers wouldn't be open to that? It seems that the medical world would be open to that, and it's totally natural to talk to the family. Absolutely. I think it's about avoiding requests done under pressure by medical staff or other. That would be ableism. So protecting people from a devaluation of their life and undue pressure.
Gregor, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. Mr. Solis, I'd like to start with you and thank you for appearing before our committee and offering an important Indigenous perspective on this conversation that we're having. I guess what I wanted to ask for you, you very correctly outlined the disparities that exist, the intergenerational trauma that is still there. I know I see it in communities where I live, the Hulkaminam speaking people, the Coast Salish, the Nuu-chah-nulth nations. I've gotten to know many elders in my time as member of parliament, and the hurt is there. It's just below the surface. I guess my question to you is, when you look at the calls to action that have been released so many years ago, and particularly on the health calls to action 18 to 24. I mean, do we need to frame this conversation about medical assistance in dying with that frame in mind, the fact that so many of those calls to action, particularly on health outcomes and the supports and services that are available to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis across Canada, are still so substandard? If you can expand on that, please.
Thank you for, excuse me. Thank you very much for the question. I think the calls to action are an excellent blueprint of moving forward, together with Indigenous peoples. I think the need for always for continuing dialogue between jurisdictions, federal, provincial, with Indigenous nations, whether they be First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. The dialogue and the conversations are are what's needed. It's the health calls to action. Absolutely, they're definitely things to utilize and to be benchmarks as we move forward. I think that there needs to be a lot of caution and concern, though, with regards to moving forward with anything, that speaks to or is about medical assistance in dying and Indigenous peoples. Sam's comments about the social indicators are things that can be misleading, because Indigenous people have such a vastly different quality of life, substandard quality of life. And when you talk about Indigenous persons with disabilities and Indigenous youth, like I said in my presentation, we're talking about the most vulnerable people of Canadian society. At the same time, we of course have to always take into consideration missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the outcomes of that. So I think that the calls to action can be one thing, but I think there's a lot more. There's probably even things, even going back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, to be very honest with you. Dust that off, look it over, and but we live in today's society as well, and so the people that are in the know, so to speak, have to be always included and involved.
You also mentioned murdered and missing Indigenous women, and I was remiss not mentioning the calls for justice that are in that report as well, and which do have some important overlap. Madam Co-Chair, I'm pretty close to the end of my time, so I'll just thank Mr. Solis for his intervention and cede the rest of my time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McGregor, and again, thank you to our witnesses. So I'll turn this back to our co-chair for a round of questions from senators.
Thank you, Co-Chair. Alors, comme la dernière fois.
As it was last time, 4 minutes for each of the first 3 senators, beginning with Senator Meji. Senator Meji, you have 4 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. My question, I think, would be for all of our panelists. Perhaps one or two could answer. What I wanted to say is that normally a doctor or any healthcare professional must explain to a patient all of the treatment options, whether it's palliative care, intensive care even, all of the options. However, from the anecdotes that I've heard in the media and from witnesses, I have the impression that these people either requested MAID or were forced to ask for MAID. What do you think, as people with a disability, do you have the impression that wherever you go, you will be forced to ask for MAID, even though you should be the ones requesting it? Is that something you fear? We could perhaps begin with the Quebec Intellectual Disability Society. That's a question that's very difficult to answer, but we can start by saying that ableism is something that's very insidious. It's not open, it's not obvious, it's not explicit often. It's in attitudes and social judgments and obstacles that people encounter in society. And sometimes it can also be at the medical level, of course. I think an answer would also be that there's a lack of services. We've seen there are staff shortages in hospitals. Our healthcare services are in a poor state, especially after the pandemic. And indirectly, that can lead people to head towards MAID rather than receiving services. That's often what we hear on the ground. But you could refuse if it's offered as an option. If another option is available, certainly, but that's often not the case. Would there be another witness, Ms. Landry, who could say something? Her opinion on that? Thank you for the question. In my dad's case, there's no one who offered it to him. It was his personal initiative. So he asked for it, and the process, as I said earlier, was a lot longer than what I've been hearing. So people were very professional, but they asked questions. They really looked into it. They came back a number of times and asked the same questions to really ensure that's what he wanted, that there was no pressure from any direction. And so it was done with respect, but they ensured that's really what he wanted. And they had his medical record, of course. That was clear. He was suffering. He no longer had quality of life. He was suffering. My dad had really enjoyed life. He hadn't talked about dying until he was really at the end of his rope, and he was suffering. He was at the end of his life in any case. He might have lived a few months. Thank you. Do I have a few seconds left? Not really, Senator. Unless it's a quick answer that you anticipate. Yes. If, for example, the government did everything it could with proactive measures to address all of the obstacles to systemic inequalities, I don't want you to tell me I'm dreaming in color, but let's suppose, do you think that everyone who had encountered inequalities in access to health care, would they not have the same inequalities in access to MAID? So who are you asking the question to? Ms. Durand-Lowe or Mr. Dago? Could you repeat the question? I'm not sure I really understood it correctly, honestly. Because of all of the systemic inequalities that certain groups experience, I'll shorten this, in the same way that you have difficulty in accessing care and services, why would it be easier to access MAID? Because it's a measure that's not expensive and that's very easy to organize and administer to people. And that's just simpler. It requires less work, less systemic work, less work on biases, less money from government. It's just simpler. Certain people, I'm not saying it's our position, but certain people have talked about eugenics. It's a term we have to be careful with, but it could be raised potentially. Thank you very much.
Sure. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank all the witnesses. My questions are for Ms. Landry. I have two questions, but before I ask them, I just want to note our appreciation for you coming and talking about a very personal and difficult topic, having lived through MAID, and it is, we really appreciate you coming and talking about a real experience and not hypothetical experiences, so thank you so much. The first question is, what difference did it make to you and your family that your father could make a decision to choose MAID as an end-of-life action?
Mon père.
My dad was of the generation of men who took charge of their lives, built families, made decisions during their whole lives, and it was important to him. It was important to us as well that he be able to choose, that he make an informed decision, of course. It's a decision he had reflected on. He decided to shorten his suffering as it was when he grew up. He grew up on the farm, and an injured horse or a dog that was suffering, it was like that. It was important for him to make those choices. He didn't want to suffer. He'd already suffered enough. So I'm pleased, I'm proud to live in a country where my dad had that choice. He didn't have to go to Switzerland or elsewhere to have access to that service.
And, the other question is, could you share with us, please, how you and your family prepared for your father's death by knowing when his death would actually be? And could you consider how different it might have been for you and your family if he had died without any preparation?
It's a question. And I ask, I mean, it was during COVID. It's 2 years ago. So we were, we were in lockdown, period, at the time. So, je vais continuer en français.
I'll continue in French. It's easier for me. So it was really during the COVID period, the beginning of COVID. So we kept him at home as long as possible. And he was in palliative care at that time with the extramural hospital that offered their services. They came into the house if he needed it. But my dad wanted to leave at the hospital. He didn't want to die at home because he would have found that difficult if my mom had died at home, probably. So he wanted to go to the hospital. But at the hospital, he couldn't receive any visitors. My mom was also in her 80s. So I found that really unacceptable that there couldn't be a family member. So I communicated with the doctor, the chief medical officer of the province, the health network, to have permission have at least one of his children be there. And be there. So we received that permission. So I was there the day before my dad left us, and my brother was there on the day that he left. So how did we prepare? The process was done gradually. My dad had been telling us for years that when he no longer had a quality of life, that he wanted to shorten his suffering. His decision had been made a long time ago, of course. He talked about it to doctors. His doctor knew it, but it wasn't his doctor who administered the procedure. But the medical team that in Restigouche is responsible for the procedure are very conscientious, and the work was done very professionally as well. So it was overtime. For my dad, it was a little too long. He would have wanted to go into the hospital and have it happen in the hours or the days that followed, but it was a lot longer. And at the end, he said it was a long wait for death. He laughed with us until the last minute, but still, he was ready. And as we told him, of course, we said our goodbyes. And when I left him, when I brought him to the hospital, of course, with my mom, well, we were crying, of course, but I respected his choice, and that was important for us to tell him. We understood his suffering, and we respected his choice. So that's something that was important to him, and it was important to us. My mom experienced that differently. My mom, well, when her dad died, she'd been with him, but her dad died a natural death, and she always said that her dad died. It was like a light that went out, a candle that went out. He died quietly. But for my dad, and now we need to think of the different emotional part. It was her spouse, the same age as her, 60 years of life together, so it was a lot more painful and more difficult because the procedure took a lot longer than she thought as well. So they injected the medication, but it took about 20 minutes before he no longer had a heartbeat. She found that difficult and painful. But it was done, and she respected his choice. And until that time, my mom always said that when she's at the end of her life, she would opt for that. But after the experience she saw with my dad, she said it's not something she would want us to go through. She wouldn't want her children to experience that the way she did. Thank you, Ms. Landry. Senator Delphon. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Thank you to the panel members for their testimony. It's very much appreciated.
For Mr. Conrad Solis. Mr. Solis, I'm happy to see you back. We've met 2 years ago when we're discussing the previous iteration of the bill. I assume you have read the report from the task force. One of the recommendations of the task force is to make sure that there is consultation with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples about making it the MAID systems that will incorporate indigenous perspectives and also what other relevant factors are to their communities. So I assume that it is, and the report also noted that to date engagement with Indigenous peoples in Canada concerning MAID has yet to occur. So I understand this, you will be in agreement with these recommendations of the task force to engage in conversations with First Nations about making it systems that will be culturally sensitive and also will be in relations with the spiritual values of the First Nations.
Thank you very much for the question. I think that when we're talking about medical assistance in dying, it's such a foreign concept in the First Nations world. From my experiences, from my growing up on the reserve, from all the work that I've done, and all the work that I continue to do. As I said, to a previous question, conversations are always needed, are always required. I think the necessity of governments to understand, as well as medical service providers, to understand, what the values and morals and perspectives are. For us, saying that we look at the world through the teachings of the medicine wheel, the emotional, the spiritual, the physical, and the mental. Those are very real to us. Those were almost lost to us. So conversations are always going to be required and necessary, even after conversations are had. They're still going to be needed more conversations, so whatever dialogue, whatever whomever, I know that there's a lot of First Nations and Indigenous people that are involved in the medical field, both as practitioners and as analysts. And when I mentioned Joyce Echaquan a while ago, and what she went through in the medical experience that she had, sadly, it's not any different than for many of us to go from our First Nation community called the Reserve and go to the local hospital in town, and we just know it's not a welcoming environment. How do you feel? How do you trust that? How do you trust an environment where you're looked down upon? The findings of the Wabanaki Health Center here in Ottawa, as well as with the Ottawa Coalition, those are the opinions and findings of people that they spoke with and responded to interviews and questions. So when you look at those conclusions, and I hope that you really do hear from the Wabano Health Clinic and the Ottawa Aboriginal Coalition, I'm sure that they would have a lot of thoughtful, meaningful things to say based on their experiences. Sorry, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Solis.
Sure.
Senator Martin, 3 minutes, please.
Thank you to all our witnesses. So maybe I'll just end with a quick question to Mr. Solis, just to give you an opportunity to tell us, what can the federal government do to care for Indigenous youth instead of offering MAID? I know that's we're discussing what would happen with mature minors, but you said you spoke to youth before this, and I think your voice is very important this evening. So what can the federal government do?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question. I believe that there's such a vacuum of youth programming and support to Indigenous youth. One of the groups that we're working with is an Indigenous group based out of Cape Breton, Oinamagi, in Nova Scotia, and they struggle and are challenged to find any kind of funding to support them to be able to have the conversations that they want to have. So that's definitely one of those things. The federal government needs to have, I think, a much stronger and better program directed towards Indigenous youth, so that they themselves can come together. They themselves can be their own leaders, and they themselves can identify the things that they want to talk about. I know invariably they're going to want to talk about language and culture and being able to connect with elders and traditional knowledge keepers and land-based learning and things like that. But they're also very serious people, and so I think if those kind of resources are provided to Indigenous youth, as well as safeguards within whatever legislation and whatever policies that are regulations that are attached to the legislation, safeguards are needed to protect the Indigenous youth of these lands.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of our panel. I'd like to thank our witnesses tonight. Ms. Jocelyn Landry, thank you for your very personal testimony about your father. Thank you to the Quebec Intellectual Disability Society. Ms. Durand-Lot and Mr. Dago, thank you for your testimony and for having answered our questions.
Mr. Conrad Solis, thank you very much for coming this evening and providing us with the perspective, the Indigenous perspective on this very, very important subject. We very much appreciate it. With that, this brings us to the end of this evening's committee meeting. So with that, we are adjourned and we will be meeting next Monday at 6:30. Thank you.